Chapter 1. The Girl with Threadbare Dream Shook. They thought I was just the girl who fixed hems and stitched buttons. They laughed at my callous fingers and thread-stained hands, but they had no idea I was sewing something far more powerful. Then dress is my revenge. My name is Elara, and for as long as I can remember, fabric was the only thing that ever hugged me back. I didn't grow up with lullabies or birthday parties. I grew up with the hum of a sewing machine, the scent of warm thread, and a mother who taught me that beauty could be created even in the ugliest places if you had enough stitches to hold yourself together. We lived in the back of a crumbling tailor shop, tucked between a butcher's stall and a bakery whose smells I could never afford. My father left when I was 6, leaving behind nothing but a broken tape measure and a stack of unpaid bills. My mother, Annette, was a gifted seamstress, the kind who could make a wedding dress from curtains and make it look like Dior. But no one famous ever walked into our little shop. Just tired women with mending needs and children with holes in their Sunday clothes. From her, I learned not just to sew, but to see. To see the hidden shapes inside every raw piece of fabric. To imagine, to transform. And while the other girls in town played with dolls, I created gowns for invisible queens in my sketchbook, using scraps from discarded linens as inspiration. But dreams, in places like mine, were considered dangerous. They made you want things the world had no intention of giving you. And every time I spoke of becoming a designer, of seeing my creations on real runways, on stages lit with more than flickering candlelight, people would smirk. A tailor's daughter? They'd sneer. Paris doesn't care about your stitches. I didn't answer them. I stitched my silence into every design. I stitched through hunger, through grief, through doubt. And every dress I made, every sleeve I hemmed, carried a secret. I was sewing a way out. I got my first job in the city when I was 19, working as a seamstress's assistant in a large atelier in Paris. It wasn't glamorous. I was paid barely enough to survive, often staying overnight to finish last-minute alterations no one would thank me for. But I didn't care. I wasn't there to be thanked. I was there to learn, to watch, to wait. I still remember the moment I first laid eyes on Isolde Laurent long before she would steal everything from me. She walked into the atelier like she owned it, tall, elegant, effortless. The kind of woman whose perfume turned heads before she spoke. She didn't sew. She didn't need to. Her job was to inspire, and she knew exactly how to make people feel smaller, starting with me. But I didn't mind. Not at first, because I had no idea that she wasn't just watching me work. She was watching to steal. Chapter 2. Stolen Threadsea should have known the moment she smiled at me. It wasn't a smile of kindness, it was the kind that held secrets behind red lips and calculated charm. But back then, I was too eager to be seen, too desperate to belong, to notice the storm she carried in her eyes. Working under Isolde was like dancing on shattered glass while pretending to float. She was demanding, sharp, and impossibly graceful even when she was cruel. To the rest of the atelier, she was a rising star in the fashion world, the protégée of the director, the muse of every magazine editor in Paris. But to me, she was both idol and illusion. I watched her every move, studied the way she flipped through fabric swatches as if she could hear them speak. I even mimicked her style: clean lines, high collars, power stitched into silhouette. She never asked for my help directly. Instead, she'd borrow my sketches, ask me to show her the stitches I'd used on a certain sleeve, casually compliment a hem before vanishing with the design still in her hand. At first, I was flattered. Foolishly so. I thought it meant she saw something in me, and she did, but not talent, weakness. She saw hunger in my eyes, the kind that made you easy to use. It all unraveled 6 weeks before the spring gala, the biggest fashion showcase of the year. Designers from Milan, London, Tokyo all gathered in one night to present their newest lines. And Isolde, of course, had secured her own debut collection. One evening, I stayed late to finish a dress form adjustment. The atelier was quiet. The only light was from the desk lamp that flickered like it too had grown tired of the late nights. My sketchbook, the one I never let out of my sight, was open beside me. Pages filled with years of designs my soul stitched in graphite. I went to wash out a stubborn stain from the hem of a silk dress. When I returned, the sketchbook was gone. Gone. Panic crawled into my lungs. I searched everywhere: under the desk, through my sewing kit, behind the bolts of fabric stacked like silent witnesses. But it was as if it had vanished into the night. The next morning, Isolde presented her new vision to the director. 10 pieces, 10 designs, all shockingly familiar. They were mine, every dart, every cut, every layered silhouette. I knew them like the lines on my own palm. She didn't even try to hide it. She just stood there, glowing in praise, letting my work crown her as Paris's next icon. And I stood in the corner, clapping with trembling hands, while something inside me began to break, not loudly, but with the quiet precision of a seam being ripped from the inside. I didn't confront her. Not then. Because I knew how this world worked. I was the nobody, she was the name, and in a world obsessed with labels, the truth didn't matter as much as who wore it better. So I stayed silent, but I began stitching something new. Not dresses, not dreams, but a plan, a pattern more dangerous than lace, a garment made not of silk or satin but of revenge. Chapter 3. The Hidden Needle. Revenge is a dish best served cold, but mine would be served with silk gloves stitched with patience, lined with precision. Because when you've been humiliated in silence, you don't scream back. You whisper and then you thread the needle. The days that followed blurred into soft gray each morning, steeped in bitterness I didn't allow to show. I still smiled when spoken to, still brought coffee to the director when asked, still pinned hems for Isolde when she waved her manicured fingers like I was her assistant. And maybe I was, for now. But behind every yes, of course, and every bowed head, I was building something, not on paper this time but in memory. Every detail of what she took, every word she said, every face that praised her while looking past me. I began to record everything. My phone, hidden between the folds of my fabric pouch, captured her creative meetings. I photographed my old designs in her office drawer. At night, I dug through my cloud backups, time-stomping each file, gathering evidence like stitches. For a final seam, I wasn't just a seamstress anymore. I was a witness, and I was preparing a case, not for a court but for the world. The plan came to me late one night, like a whisper carried by the hum of my old sewing machine. I remembered Madame Roussel, an aging fashion journalist who had once visited the atelier, dismissed like dust by Isolde. The old woman had eyes that saw past the gloss. She had once told me, talent needs no spotlight, it burns on its own. I found her email. Then I wrote. Not begging, not exposing, just a note. Would you be interested in a story Paris forgot to look at? One stitched behind the curtains? Her reply came an hour later. Tell me everything. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I rewrote the beginning of my story, not the way it had happened, but the way it would now unfold. I wasn't going to rip Isolde's name off the spotlight. I was going to let it burn through her, until the world saw what lies underneath borrowed brilliance. But this wouldn't be enough. The truth, no matter how sharp, needed a stage. And so, I signed up for something I had never dared before. The New Voices competition, an anonymous fashion design showcase for undiscovered talents. My submission would be made from the exact patterns she stole. But this time, they would carry my signature, my essence. My fury.it would be the same silhouette. Yes, but darker, more precise, with every seam a statement. Where hers had been beauty, mine would be truth. She might have worn the dress first, but I would be the one remembered for it. Chapter 4. Threads of Truth. Fabric remembers the hands that shaped it. If that's true, then every piece I touched now carried a storm. Not rage but a quiet, relentless resolve. I locked myself in the tiny apartment for days. Curtains drawn, world muted. I worked like a woman possessed. The hum of the sewing machine became my heartbeat, and the scattered sketches on the floor my roadmap to vengeance. I didn't need sleep. I needed silence. And thread. The competition deadline was 2 weeks away. 2 weeks to create what should have taken 2 months. But time has a way of bending when your soul is on fire. I went back to my earliest designs, the ones Isolde had stolen and paraded on the runways like trophies. I didn't want to make something new. No. I wanted to reclaim what was mine. But I wouldn't just recreate it. I would evolve it, sharpen it, darken it, refine it until it bore my soul and hers had no place left to hide. For the bodice, I chose black silk, not soft and sensual, but firm, deliberate. The kind of black that swallowed light. For the embroidery, I selected crimson thread and stitched thorns into roses, pain into beauty. Each stitch a memory. The day I cried in the storeroom, the silence of being overlooked, the applause stolen from my fingertips, and the final touch. I added a lining barely visible unless you looked closely. Inside, I sewed a quote in blood-red thread. The hands you stepped on will one day rise and clasp your crown. My fingers bled. Literally. I pricked myself more than once, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The pain became part of the process, like penance for the years I let myself be invisible. I didn't sign my name on the form. That was the beauty of new voices. Anonymous judging. Raw talent. No titles. Let the judges be blind to names. Let the dress speak for itself. As the submission day arrived, I folded the gown gently like a secret held too long. I wrapped it in plain muslin, tied it with thin twine. No logos, no drama, just the truth, cut and sewn into every seam. I delivered it myself, walking into the submission office with quiet steps and a steady gaze. No one looked twice at me, and that was exactly the point. Let them underestimate me one last time, because next time, they'd know my name, not whispered in the corners of studios, but carved into the fabric of fashion itself. Chapter 5. Unmasking. The Musithy didn't know my name, but they knew the dress, and that was enough to make the ground beneath them shift. A week after I submitted the gown, the first whispers reached me, not directly, of course. They trickled through hushed conversations and cafes, stray comments. In the elevator at the fashion school I used to clean, even my old co-workers in the workshop where I used to be, the silent one had suddenly found reasons to talk about entry 47, piece so bold, so haunting, it had moved a judge to tears. Tears. Imagine that. They were calling it the Thorn Queen. I never named it that, but it fit. The rose and its thorns, the pain woven into beauty. My pain. I watched Isolde from afar that week. Social media was her kingdom, and her carefully curated life continued like a flawless performance. She was smiling in interviews, attending parties, flaunting a new capsule collection, bright, airy, soulless. No one had noticed the shift yet, but I did. She was wearing desperation like perfume, and I could smell it from a mile away, because while she basked in artificial light, something real had entered the scene. My design, my voice. When the semi-finalists were announced, I didn't even check the list. I didn't need to. A girl from the committee called me. "We need to verify your eligibility," she said, her voice careful but charged with a kind of restrained excitement. I confirmed my details. I gave them nothing more than required, and when she said, "Congratulations, Elara, you've made it," I simply replied, "Thank you," as though she'd just informed me the weather would be warm tomorrow. But inside I was burning. Not from pride, from justice. The fashion house hosting the competition, a prestigious label Isolde had tried for years to impress, shared an anonymous teaser of the semi-finalists. My gown was front and center. It dominated the photo. Rich shadows, bold silhouette, power stitched in silence. And the comments? They flooded in like rain through a broken roof. Who made this? I've never seen anything like it. This is the future of fashion. Even Isolde posted it to her story, not knowing it was mine, captioning it, "Brilliant work, whoever you are." I stared at that for a long time. The irony soaked every inch of my skin. She was clapping for her own demise. My design had become her shadow everywhere she went. People asked about it. Who was this designer? What inspired them? Was it someone new? Someone bold? And then it happened. 2 days before the final showcase, I received an email from House Marlowe. The very brand that once rejected me through Isolde's lips, now invited me personally to attend the showcase as a featured semi-finalist, not as a guest, not as a tag-along.as a creator. That was the moment I knew. I didn't need revenge made of fury. I just needed a spotlight, and now, it was finally turning my way. Chapter 6. The spotlight burns both ways. They told me to arrive early. They said there would be interviews. What they didn't say was that Isolde would be there too. The venue glimmered with modern elegance, marble floors that echoed your every step, gold-framed mirrors reflecting ambition from every corner, and chandeliers that looked like frozen fireworks. As I walked into the main hall, badge around my neck, a soft hush fell over a small crowd. Eyes turned. I wasn't wearing anything extravagant, just a simple black suit I'd stitched myself, clean lines, sharp shoulders, tailored to my exact dimensions, but I walked like I belonged, because I did. One of the coordinators waved me over. "Elara, yes? You're scheduled for your press photos in 10 minutes. We've also got a private room for your interview with Vogue Digital." Vogue. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. Hadn't Isolde once told me that Vogue doesn't interview nobodies? I remembered that moment so vividly, how she said it with a smirk while tearing apart one of my early sketches. Now here I was, and just as I nodded my thanks to the coordinator, the elevator doors opened. She stepped out. Isolde. She wore red, a floor-length silk gown that clung to her frame like a whispered warning. Her hair was swept up. Her heels clicked against the marble with practiced elegance. And yet, her eyes faltered when she saw me. Only for a second, but I saw it. That flicker of confusion, recognition, then disbelief. Elara, she said, her voice uncertain. I turned to her slowly, as if she were nothing more than a soft sound behind me. Hello, Isolde? There was a moment where the world seemed to pause just long enough for 1,000 unspoken memories to bloom between us. The basement workshops, the condescending critiques, the stolen dreams. She recovered quickly. I didn't realize you were competing. I didn't realize you were judging, I replied, though I knew she wasn't. She was here because she needed the proximity to stay relevant. Well, she said, forcing a smile. Best of luck. It's a big stage. It is, I said, letting the words settle. But not everyone can handle the heat. And I walked away, not fast, not dramatic, just enough to let her see that I wasn't afraid of her anymore. Later that evening, the showcase began. My gown was the finale. It came down the runway worn by a model with striking features and a gaze as sharp as the needle that stitched every seam. The crowd gasped. People leaned forward. Phones rose like waves at a concert. And Isolde. She sat in the third row. I didn't look directly at her, but I could feel her watching. Her silence was louder than applause, because when the final spotlight dimmed and the host stepped forward to announce the winner, they didn't say her name. They said mine, Elara Betrayal. My hands shook. Not from nerves, from release. Years of swallowed pain, of invisible labor, of watching my ideas dressed in someone else's success now melting away beneath the warmth of earned recognition. As I stepped onto the stage, the audience rose, a standing ovation. But I only heard one sound clearly, the sound of a pedestal cracking, and it wasn't mine. Chapter 7. The price of becoming seen. They say fame changes you. But they never mention how it also exposes you, peeling back your past, layer by painful layer, for the world to judge. I thought the stage would be the hardest part, the sleepless nights, the bleeding fingers, the invisible battles of sewing through grief and ambition in equal measure. But nothing prepared me for what came after the applause, because after you're seen, truly seen, the world stops whispering and starts watching, and watching isn't always kind. The morning after my win, my name trended online. Not for the dress, but for the story. Elara Betrayal, orphan seamstress, becomes fashion's dark horse, from basement to runway queen. And then Elara's mentor speaks. I gave her everything. She betrayed me. The headline punched the breath out of me. I didn't have to click to know who it was. Isolde. Of course, she would spin her own narrative. She knew how to wear victimhood like velvet. In the interview, she spoke of generosity, of taking me in, of shaping me. And then she hinted at theft. She took designs that weren't hers, she claimed. Ideas she wouldn't have understood if it weren't for me. Lies, vicious, bitter lies. But the comments poured in. Typical rags to riches thief. She looks fake. Her success feels forced. Is she really that talented or just good at crying? I stared at the screen for too long, letting the words soak into my bones like acid. And then I closed the laptop, not to ignore it, but to return to what had always grounded me. My hands, my craft, the truth I stitch into every fiber. I spent the next week in near silence, working in a sunlit corner of my studio, surrounded by fabrics that didn't accuse me of anything. The hum of the sewing machine steadied my heartbeat. Each stitch reminded me of who I was before the interviews, before the whispers, before the spotlight, until one morning, a letter slid under my door, a real letter. No sender, just my name on the front in gold ink. Inside, a single sentence. You buried the past, but it still breathes. I held the paper like it might combust in my fingers, because I knew exactly what it meant. Not Isolde, someone else, someone I had tried to forget. That night, I couldn't sleep. Memories clawed at me, damp floors, the smell of mold and perfume. A voice that used to soothe and manipulate in the same breath. There were things I hadn't told anyone, things I had locked away, even from myself. And now, someone wanted them unearthed. I stared at the letter again and whispered to the darkness. Not now, not when I've finally begun. But deep down, I knew, The past does not wait for permission. It arrives like a needle pricking your skin in the middle of a masterpiece. So I poured myself a glass of water, sat by the window, and began to write. Not designs, not sketches, but truth, my truth. If the world wanted a story, I would give them one, but it would be on my terms. No edits, no filters, just the girl behind the stitches, still bleeding, still breathing, still here. Chapter 8. The threads of the past. They say the past is dead, but I know better. The past doesn't die, it lingers, like a frayed thread you try to cut, only to find it woven into every seam of who you are. The letter haunted me, not because of the words, but because of the handwriting, slanted, elegant, familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. I had seen it once on a birthday card written in smudged ink and desperation. A card I had kept hidden in a show box beneath my bed in the orphanage. A card signed, Love Always, Aunt Celeste, a name I hadn't spoken in over 15 years. She wasn't my real aunt, just one of my mother's oldest friends, a woman with crimson lips and a voice like honey mixed with whiskey. The kind of woman who smiled as she made promises and vanished before the ink on them dried. She had taken me in for a while, after my mother's death, a month, maybe 2, long enough to make me feel like I might belong somewhere, long enough to break me when she walked out without goodbye. And now, after all this time, she had returned, or at least, her shadows had. I stared at the letter until dawn, the sky outside my studio painted in soft blues and ash gray clouds. The city felt quieter than usual, as if holding its breath with me. I didn't know what she wanted or why she had resurfaced now, when I finally had something to lose, but I knew one thing: I couldn't look away anymore. So I dressed carefully that morning. Not in silk or sequins, not in the armor of a rising designer, but in something old, a wool coat with a tear beneath the collar, a memory sewn into every pocket. I needed to be her again, the girl who had nothing but her wits and her hands, because that girl, she could survive anything, even Aunt Celeste. I found her in a place as faded as our history, a jazz bar turned antique bookstore on Rue de Lys, where the dust hung in golden beams and nothing was quite alphabetized. She sat in the farthest corner, flipping through a book with gloved hands, still beautiful in the way ruin can be. When she looked up, she smiled like we had tea every Sunday. Elara, she purred, as if my name had always tasted sweet on her tongue. You've become radiant. I didn't sit. Not yet. What do you want? She closed the book slowly. A play by Jean Genet. I noticed how blunt you've become, she sighed. I suppose life has no time for poetry anymore. I leaned against the shelf, heart sharp in my chest. I got your letter. She nodded, eyes gleaming. I know. That's why you're here. The next few minutes were a dancer's of cryptic metaphors, mine of silent fury. She spoke of debts unpaid, of secrets locked behind bloodlines, of my mother's death not being as simple as I'd believed. She was silenced, darling. She whispered, by people who now shake your hand on red carpets. My breath caught. What are you talking about? Celeste only smiled, and then she slid something across the table. An envelope. Inside, an old photograph, my mother, Celeste, and a man I had never seen before, tall, powerful, with a scar along his cheek and a hand placed far too intimately on my mother's shoulder. His name, Celeste said softly, is now sewn into your success. My blood turned to ice, because I had seen that face before, on the board of the fashion house that had just offered me a partnership, the very name I had longed to see next to mine in gold foil. I stumbled out of the bookstore, the photo burning in my coat pocket like a buried matchbox. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my work, my rise suddenly cracked at the foundation. The past was not only breathing. It had teeth, and it had just bitten back. That night, as I sat in my studio, staring at the ghost of my mother's smile in that photo, I made a vow: if I was going to rise, I would do so by unraveling every lie that built the empire they tried to own me through, thread by thread, truth by truth, even if I had to burn it all down first. Chapter 9. A stitch in Betrayal. They built empires on lies, but I was raised in the ruins, and I had learned how to make beauty from broken things. I didn't sleep that night. The photo stayed beside me on the work table, its edges worn from where my fingers kept returning to it as if touch alone could rewrite its truth. The man in the picture haunted me. Victor Darmand, co-founder of Maison V, visionary, philanthropist, monster. I had met him once briefly, at the gala where my designs first caught fire. He had offered a glass of champagne and a compliment laced with possession. I had smiled politely, unaware that his name might have been the last thing my mother ever whispered in fear. Now, every smile I had given him tasted like betrayal in my mouth. I needed proof. So I returned to the only place no one would think to look, the past. I went to the archives of Maison V, a cold, silent room hidden beneath their Paris headquarters. Only a handful of staff had clearance. I wasn't one of them, but I had something better, a nameplate and ID badge left behind by the studio manager, who had once called me the future of fashion before being quietly fired last season. I slid through the shadows like thread through silk. In the archives, I searched not for ledgers or press clippings, but for patterns, and I found them scattered in old letters, production memos, and design registries from 20 years ago, names that didn't belong, payments marked as consulting fees to an unknown shell company, and worst of all, sketches drawn by a hand I knew better than my own, my mother's, the signature curled in the corner like a whisper. Eloni's designs dated months before her death, designs that looked eerily like the ones Victor Darmand had claimed as his own during the house's launch collection. My hands trembled. He hadn't just stolen her work, he had built his empire with it. He had erased her, buried her genius beneath his charm and power, and the world applauded him for it. I left the archives with a USB drive tucked into the lining of my coat, my breath shallow, my mind spinning. There was no more doubt. The thread of betrayal ran through every seam of my career, and I had unknowingly stitched myself into their legacy. But not anymore. Back at my studio, I stared at my new collection, half-formed gowns draped on mannequins, waiting to be finished. But how could I finish beauty on the bones of a lie? I stepped back and began ripping seams open, undoing every line, every fold, every illusion. I would not debut this collection. I would destroy it, and then I would make something new. Not for them, not for applause, but for justice. They would see what she created. They would see who I was. And when I walked onto that runway, it wouldn't be as Elara, the girl they thought they owned. It would be as Eleni's daughter, the seamstress who sowed her revenge not with rage, but with truth. Chapter 10. The show must burn. They say the runway is a stage for beauty. Tonight, it would become a trial by fire, and I was both the witness and the executioner. The Grand Palais was gilded in gold and deception. Spotlights blazed across polished marble floors. Velvet ropes held back the swarm of photographers, editors, and influencers, all buzzing like bees in a hive of illusion. The new face of Maison V was set to reveal their legacy-defining collection. No one knew that tonight. The only thing being revealed was the truth. I stood backstage, heart a drumbeat of fury and clarity. I wore black, not couture, not glamour, but a simple fitted suit my mother once designed for herself. The fabric had been salvaged from a bolt she dyed by hand in our old apartment. She used to say, even ash has memory. Stitch it with grace. I had not sewn anything new. I didn't need to. I was the final creation. The show began with predictable fanfare. Models glided in silk and shadow, the crowd leaning in with practiced awe. Victor Darmand sat in the front row, his silver hair impeccable, his false modesty rehearsed. When the 10th look stepped out, a dramatic crimson gown identical to one my mother had sketched in 1999, I felt bile rise in my throat. That was the moment. I stepped onto the stage. Gasps rippled like a wave through the audience. I walked to the center of the runway and took the mic from the presenter's hand. My voice, though quiet, sliced the air with precision. Good evening. My name is Elara, and this is not your scheduled finale. Victor shifted in his seat. I looked straight at him, then at the crowd. You have applauded stolen beauty for over 2 decades. You have worshipped at the feet of a house built on the bones of a woman who was never given credit. That woman was my mother, Eloni St. Clair. And these designs? Her hands birthed them. Her blood paid for them. The room froze. No one moved. I pulled the remote from my pocket and clicked. Behind me, the massive LED screen flickered and then illuminated with files, dates, scanned sketches, payments, signatures, memos, proof. A decade's worth. Whispers became murmurs. Murmurs became outrage. Victor rose, his face pale. This is slander, he began. I turned to him with calm venom. No, this is justice. Security hesitated. No one dared move in the face of this public unraveling. Journalists stood up, phones recording, streaming, witnessing history. And then, like the most poetic crescendo, I lifted the hem of the gown on display and showed the hidden embroidery stitched in red thread, Ls. 1999, the truth. Sewn in plain sight, the lights dimmed, not as part of the show, but because the show was over. I walked off the stage not as a designer begging for applause, but as a daughter delivering reckoning. I had burned their illusion. Now, from those ashes, I would stitch something real, not a legacy they gave me, but one I claimed for myself. Chapter 11. The price of truth. Silence after a storm is the loudest sound of all. That night, when I returned to my flat, the city had gone eerily quiet. Paris, normally vibrant, impatient, now felt like it was holding its breath, watching me from every dark window and whispering alley. I had shattered something sacred, and now, I had to face what was left behind. Within hours, my name was everywhere. The seamstress who exposed a giant, Maison V's shameful theft revealed by ex-intern. Was Eloni St. Clair the true visionary? My phone exploded. Hundreds of calls, thousands of messages. I turned it off by noon. Not because I didn't want to know, but because I already did. Some called me a hero, some called me a liar, and too many called me dangerous. Maison V released a statement by morning, denying everything. Of course, they claimed I had falsified documents, hacked their archives, manipulated my mother's story for personal gain. They didn't say her name, not once. As if her existence still needed to be erased to protect their empire. I was ready for this. I thought I was. But nothing prepares you for the cold shoulder of the world you used to admire. Overnight, I became radioactive. The boutique where I worked part-time let me go. My mentor from fashion school unfollowed. A former classmate texted, "You should have just stayed quiet. You were finally in, like a dog allowed into a ballroom just long enough to be fed crumbs then thrown back out into the alley the second she barks." But I didn't bark. I roared. And now, they were scared of what I might do next. Still, not everyone turned their back. 2 days later, I received an anonymous envelope. Inside was a single photo: my mother, standing beside a younger Victor Darmand, both smiling in front of a dress form. On the back, in a rushed, shaky hand, she was always better than him. They just couldn't handle it. There was no name, just an address. An atelier in Montmartre. I went, because I had nothing left to lose, and that's where I found her, Marcel, an old seamstress, long retired, who once worked beside my mother in the early days before fame and betrayal. Her eyes welled with tears the moment she saw me. "Elara," she whispered, touching my face. "You are her echo, her vengeance, and her redemption." We sat together on the floor, surrounded by bolts of untouched fabric and dust-covered sketches. She pulled out a notebook wrapped in silk ribbon. "My El only kept this. Never let it go." Inside were dozens of unfinished designs, some rough, others precise, all of them marked with her signature, delicate, sharp, alive. And then, on the very last page, a blank canvas. No sketch, just a line, written in my mother's hand. The final stitch is hers. I broke, not from grief, but from the weight of being seen, finally, seen. I wasn't just a seamstress anymore, or a shadow of a forgotten woman. I was the one who would finish what she began, not for revenge, but for truth, for healing, for legacy. The price of truth had been steep: isolation, disgrace, exile. But in losing everything, I found what mattered most: my voice, and I would no longer sew in silence. Chapter 12. The needle and the flame. People say a woman who's lost everything is dangerous. They're wrong. It's the woman who's lost everything and found her purpose. She's the one who burns down empires. After that day in Marcel's atelier, I didn't return to the apartment in Rue de la Tour. I moved into her modest space above the shop. It smelled of lavender oil and thyme, of old spools and thread wax. It smelled like my mother's hands. Each morning, I lit a candle beside the sketchbook. I whispered her name. Then I stitched. One hem, one hope, one memory at a time. News about Maison V continued to spiral. Leaks, testimonies, anonymous interns coming forward. A former assistant designer confessed to being paid to copy Eleni's work. Whispers turned into screams. Investors pulled out. Victor Darman disappeared from the public eye. But I wasn't watching anymore. I was building. I started with one dress, a resurrection. It was based on one of my mother's unfinished designs, but I didn't replicate it. I spoke with it, translated it, reimagined it. Fabric, reclaimed silk dyed with crushed marigold petals. Stitches, imperfect, intentional. Neckline, open like a wound that's learned to stay soft. I called it the reckoning. Then came another, in bloom after fire, and another, the seam of silence. Each piece told a story. Each piece was a weapon disguised as art. Marcel posted one photo of my work on an old designer's forum. Within days, emails began to trickle in. Women, artists, survivors. I saw your dress. It felt like mine. I was silenced too. Can I model for you? My sister was an intern at Maisonville. She cried when she saw your post. I didn't need approval from glossy magazines or runways soaked in ego. I had something better, a tribe. We called ourselves Atelier Echo. We took in anyone the fashion world had cast aside: aging seamstresses, disabled tailors, immigrants without paperwork, designers who had been told they were too strange, too loud, too much. Inside our walls, every body was worthy, every scar had a place, every silence had a sound. Our first show was held in an abandoned greenhouse in the 11th arrondissement. We stitched leaves into corsets. We embroidered heartbreak onto veils. We danced between vines and broken glass. There were no front rows, only mirrors, so everyone had the best seat in the house. When I stepped out for the final bow, the applause wasn't thunderous. It was tearful, tender, true. That night, I opened the last page of my mother's sketchbook once more. The blank canvas still stared at me, but I no longer feared it. I picked up my pencil and drew a design neither hers nor mine, but ours, because the flame she passed to me wasn't for destruction. It was for illumination. And with each stitch, I lit the path for every woman who had ever been forgotten, silenced, or sewn into shadows, and I was just getting started. Chapter 13, The Return of the Ghost. They say ghosts can't hurt you, but they've clearly never been haunted by someone who's still alive. The letter came folded in 3, sealed with a wax crest I hadn't seen in almost a year. It arrived on a morning when the Paris air smelled like wet stone and blooming regrets. I had just finished sketching the final look for our winter show, something raw, something unfinished, when Marcel entered the atelier, her face pale. You may want to sit down, she said, but I didn't, because deep down, I already knew. I opened the envelope with fingers steady, heart storming. It was from him, Victor. His words bled with apology, like a man who had rehearsed remorse in the mirror but still didn't understand how much damage silence can do. Elara, I know I don't deserve a response, but I'm not asking for redemption, only truth. I'm in Paris, one last time. I need to see you. No press, no cameras, just us, just honesty. I owe you that, even if it's all I have left to give. If you come, I'll be waiting where it all began. Tuesday, dusk, the cafe behind the old conservatory. Of course it would be there, where he first saw me sewing by candlelight. Where he first told me my hands were poetry, where the betrayal began, quiet, sweet, and slow like the steeping of poisoned tea. Marcel didn't ask what I would do. She just placed her hand on mine, as if grounding me back into my own body. You don't owe him anything, she whispered. I know, I said. And yet, I still went, not for him, for myself, for the girl I used to be, wide-eyed, thread-stained, and hungry for love. She deserved to see the truth with her own eyes. He was already there when I arrived, wearing the same charcoal coat I remembered, except now it hung off him like penance. He stood when I entered. I did not sit. I stayed standing, towering in heels stitched by hands far more honest than his. You look, he started. Don't, I said. He nodded. The silence was thick, not bitter, not angry, just exhausted. Then he spoke. I lost everything. You misplaced it, I replied. There's a difference. His eyes, those same clever, calculating eyes, softened for once. I never meant to destroy you. No, I said, voice low. You meant to use me. You just didn't think I'd rise after. He bowed his head. Why did you come, Elara? I paused, then answered the question he didn't ask. To see if I still hated you. And I don't. He looked up, startled. I don't feel anything. And that, Victor, is the most powerful thing I've ever felt. I walked away before he could speak again, out into the Paris dusk, where the sky wore the same bruised hue as my past. But I was no longer part of that painting. I was the one holding the brush now, and I had one chapter left to finish, a final stitch, a final reckoning, a final dawn, and the world wasn't ready. Chapter 14. The last stitch. They thought I wanted revenge, but revenge was never the point. What I truly wanted was to be free. The atelier was bathed in gold that morning. not just the sunlight streaming through the tall windows, but something deeper, something earned. There was a stillness in the room, like breath held before a first note, or the hush. Before the curtain rises, I stood before my final creation. The dress.it was nothing like the others. No extravagant lace, no screaming colors, just fabric, the shade of healing skin, threaded with silence and stitched with every lesson. The pain had gifted me. On the inner hem, I sewed one final phrase just for me. You survived her. You survived him. You survived you. The fashion world didn't expect what I gave them. They came for spectacle. I gave them truth. When the lights dimmed and the music began, my models didn't strut. They walked like women who had lived through something, who had cried into bathroom sinks, who had picked themselves up from cold marble floors, who had lost and dared to rebuild. Each dress carried a story. Each step echoed with quiet power. But the final piece, that one, I wore myself. As I stepped onto the runway, the room held its breath, not because I was beautiful, not because I was famous, but because they saw a woman who had once been broken, walking tall, unshaken, unwound. I didn't smile. I didn't wave. I just looked forward, because the past had no place in my line of sight anymore. When the final spotlight faded, there was silence, then an eruption. Not just applause, but something raw, rising, reverent. They weren't clapping for fabric, they were clapping for freedom. For every woman who had been discarded, for every voice that had been softened to survive, for every girl who had stitched herself back together one bleeding seam at a time. Later, alone in the studio, I untied my hair and looked at myself in the mirror. Not the seamstress, not the ghost, not the lover, or the liar, or the child, just Elara, the woman I had become. Here's what they never told us. Sometimes revenge doesn't look like fire. Sometimes it looks like peace. Sometimes it's not about burning the world down. It's about refusing to let them live inside you anymore. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's a door you walk through and never let them follow. And as I turned off the lights for the last time, I whispered to the girl I used to be, we made it, and we'll never need them again. To every woman who's ever been dismissed, betrayed, silenced, or overlooked, your worth is not measured by who couldn't see it. Your power is not diminished by who tried to take it. And your future? It's stitched into your own hands. Keep sewing, keep rising, keep choosing you.